The car door was still swinging open when my son said, "Then walk home," and dropped the keys like they meant nothing. Still holding the edge of the seat, I didn't beg. I watched him drive off in the vehicle I owned. As the dust settled, I felt the heat of the sun and something colder. His entitlement. While the wind picked up, I remembered whose name was on the title, and it damn sure wasn't his. The same boy I raised to be grateful had just mistaken control for inheritance. That's when I walked home and filed the paperwork that walked him out of my future. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The sun had just begun to dip behind the hills, casting a warm, amber glow over the rugged landscape as Marjorie sat quietly beside Blake in the front seat of the SUV. The drive back from the Talbot family breakfast had been tense, the kind of tension that made the air in the car thick and suffocating, but neither of them had spoken much. The quiet was more uncomfortable than the shouting had ever been. Blake's hands gripped the wheel a little too tightly, knuckles pale against the steering column. His jaw clenched intermittently, as if he was trying to hold something back, something sharp, ready to be unleashed. The quiet was becoming unbearable, and Marjorie, as always, was the first to break it. "You're driving too fast," she said softly, her eyes tracing the lines of the highway ahead. "You need to slow down." Blake's eyes flicked to her, then back to the road. He exhaled sharply, a frustrated hiss through his teeth. "Always making things harder," he muttered under his breath. His voice, sharp with irritation, cut through the tension in the car like a knife. "You can't just let things go, can you?" Marjorie's gaze didn't leave the window. She'd been used to his outbursts, had been dealing with them for decades now, but today was different. She was tired. Tired of trying to keep the peace, tired of always being the one to swallow her words. "I'm asking you to slow down for a reason," she said, keeping her tone even. "Respect, Blake. I've asked for it more times than I can count." Her words hung in the air for a moment, but Blake didn't respond. Instead, he slammed the gas pedal down, pushing the car faster. The engine roared louder as if in defiance of her request. Marjorie felt a pang in her chest, a familiar sting, the one she'd felt for years whenever Blake's anger flared. The weight of his entitlement pressed against her, suffocating. But she didn't flinch. She'd learned long ago not to let him see her bend. He swerved slightly, taking the next exit too sharply, and Marjorie braced herself for whatever would come next. The car jerked to a stop at a turnout along the highway. The engine idled angrily, vibrating in the stillness. She looked over at him, her expression calm but unreadable. Blake stared straight ahead, his breathing heavy. He couldn't look at her, couldn't meet her eyes. And then, without a word, he threw the car into park. "If you can't ride without criticizing," he said, his voice raw with contempt, "walk home." The words felt like a slap, a physical blow, though he hadn't raised a hand. Marjorie's heart pounded in her chest, but she didn't move. She sat still, the world outside the car seeming to grow smaller, quieter, like the entire universe was holding its breath. He reached across her, grabbing the keys from the ignition with a swift, jerking motion. For a moment their hands brushed, but there was no softness in it. His fingers were cold and sharp, like everything about him now. Blake didn't look at her as he tossed the keys onto the passenger seat, the metallic clink echoing in the car like a final note in a long, unfinished song. And then, without another word, he shoved the gear shift into drive and sped off, tires screeching against the pavement, kicking up dust in the air behind him. Marjorie sat there for a long moment, the engine's growl fading into the distance, leaving only the sound of her own breathing. Her fingers hovered over the keys on the seat beside her, but she didn't touch them. Not yet. Not until she was ready. Her gaze shifted toward the rearview mirror, but the SUV was already a speck on the horizon. She felt a strange calm settling over her, a stillness that had nothing to do with the silence around her. This was no longer about him, or his temper, or his expectations. It was about something else now, something she'd been too afraid to name for years. She opened the door, her feet hitting the ground with a soft thud. The chill of the evening air bit at her skin, but she didn't flinch. She stood for a moment, looking at the long, winding road ahead of her, a stretch of highway that seemed endless, but also oddly freeing. In the distance, she could just make out the faint shape of the ranch house, a place that had never truly felt like hers, not the way it should have. But things were different now. She had the keys. The silence in the SUV seemed endless, but Marjorie wasn't bothered by it. It was almost peaceful. The hum of the engine beneath her, the rhythmic turn of the wheels. She kept her hands on the steering wheel, her knuckles steady. Each turn of the road was deliberate, measured, like she was slowly moving away from everything she'd ever allowed herself to tolerate. And yet, there was no rush to it. She wasn't in a hurry to get home. Blake's car, Kendra's SUV, roared off into the distance, but she didn't chase after it. She didn't want to. Instead, she drove the way she always should have, slowly, carefully, as though every mile brought her closer to the one thing she had never truly claimed, herself. The ranch house loomed ahead as she pulled into the gravel driveway. The wind stirred the dry grass around the edges of the yard. It was a good place, once full of promises, but now she saw it differently. The land, the house, the memories. They were hers now, completely. For the first time, she felt that deep sense of ownership, not just of the place, but of her own life. She turned off the engine and sat for a moment just breathing, before stepping out. The weight of the keys still sat heavily in her pocket. Blake had tossed them aside so carelessly, but he didn't understand. He never did. They weren't just keys to a car, they were a symbol of her control. She carried them now, not because of the car, but because they gave her something Blake would never have again. Inside, she walked with slow, deliberate steps to her file cabinet, the one that had been pushed into the back corner of the study all these years. She hadn't thought much about it for a while. It had become a fixture, a piece of the room that didn't really matter. But today, it was different. She was the one who would decide what mattered. The cabinet opened with a soft creak. She pulled out the stack of papers, the title to the house, the ranch, the accounts. And there it was, tucked at the back of the pile, the pink slip. Marjorie Elaine Talbot, registered owner. It was simple, unassuming. No grandeur to it, nothing that would have screamed power to anyone else. But to her, it was everything. She ran her fingers over the signature at the bottom. Her name. A reminder that she was the one who had worked for everything in her life, who had built this place. And yet, for years, she'd let Blake act as though it was all his entitlement suffocating her sense of self. But now, there would be no more of that. The doorbell rang. She had been expecting it. It was Dottie. "Well, look at you," Dottie said, her voice laced with both amusement and approval. "You're standing tall now, aren't you?" Marjorie nodded, not bothering to hide the small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "He's confused me with a doormat for too long." Dottie shook her head, her gaze flicking to the papers in Marjorie's hands. "It's about time you started reclaiming what's yours. He's had his say for too long. Now, it's your turn." Marjorie didn't respond at first. She couldn't. There was something profound in what Dottie said, something that settled deeper than any words had before. She hadn't realized how long she had been waiting for someone to say it aloud, to give her the space to stop apologizing for existing in the shadow of someone else's demands. "He gave me space," Marjorie said finally, her voice soft but firm. "I'm taking it." Dottie let out a low whistle. "That boy thinks he owns everything, doesn't he?" But you've got the title, Marjorie, not him. Marjorie picked up the phone, her fingers tapping the familiar number for Eli Frey, her longtime attorney. She had trusted him for years, kept him on retainer, but she hadn't truly needed him, until now. This time, she was ready for what he could help her do. The phone rang 3 times before Eli answered. "Eli," Marjorie began, her voice steady but with a quiet edge. "I need a meeting. As soon as possible." "Of course," he said, his voice warm but businesslike. "What's on your mind?" "I'm making some changes," she replied, glancing once more at the title in her hand. "We need to discuss the trust, the house, the ranch, everything. I need to make sure it's all in order, and I'm removing Blake and Kendra from the will." There was a long pause on the other end. Eli was silent for just a moment too long. "Understood," he finally said, his tone measured but with an undercurrent of respect that Marjorie had never heard before. "I'll set it up. You can come by tomorrow morning. We'll go over everything." "Thank you, Eli," she said, and hung up. Dottie was watching her, a knowing look on her face. "That's the first step," she said quietly. "Now, you take your time with the rest. You've earned it." Marjorie stood there for a moment, the weight of the decisions ahead of her pressing down, but there was no fear now. Not anymore. She looked out the window at the vast empty land that stretched before her. The ranch, the house, the history. Now it was all hers to shape however she chose. And there was no going back. The phone buzzed on the kitchen counter, its bright screen lighting up the otherwise dim room. Marjorie had been avoiding it for hours, but now the persistent vibration was impossible to ignore. She hadn't responded to Blake's earlier text, nor had she even glanced at it. She knew exactly what it would say: another apology, another half-hearted attempt at reconciling. He always believed he could fix things with a few words, but Marjorie was done. Words no longer had power over her. With a sigh, she walked over to the counter and picked up the phone. Blake's message blinked at her in black and white. "Mom, I'm sorry. Please come home. We can work this out. I didn't mean it. Just, please, come back." She stared at it for a moment, her thumb hovering over the screen, ready to type a response. But she didn't. The message was empty. He was sorry because he didn't like the consequences of his actions, not because he understood them. Marjorie's finger dropped onto the delete button, erasing the message without so much as a second thought. Instead, she opened the Contacts app. A quiet but firm determination settled over her as she dialed the Broadleaf Credit Union. The call rang through, the sound smooth and familiar. "Good afternoon, Broadleaf Credit Union. How can I assist you?" came the chipper voice on the other end. "This is Marjorie Talbot," she said, her voice calm and controlled. "I'd like to transfer the title of my vehicle into a trust account, effective immediately." The woman on the other end was quiet for a moment. Marjorie could hear the faint tapping of keys before the response came. "Certainly, Mrs. Talbot. I'll transfer you to our trust services department." Moments later, a new voice, warm yet professional, came through. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Talbot. I understand you wish to make a title transfer?" "Yes," Marjorie said firmly, sitting down at the kitchen table. She ran her fingers over the edges of the papers in front of her, the trust documents Eli had prepared. "I'd like to put the title of my car in the trust. The vehicle is no longer under my son's control." There was a brief pause, and then the woman's voice softened, acknowledging the change with a professionalism that Marjorie appreciated. "I'll begin the paperwork for the transfer immediately. Please hold while I prepare the necessary forms." As she waited, Marjorie glanced out the window, watching the sun dip lower on the horizon, casting long shadows across the ranch. It was almost surreal, the simplicity of it all. Blake had never understood how easily things could slip from his grasp, how a single moment could shift everything. He thought he had all the time in the world to make things right, but she had already taken the first step away from him, away from the years of being silenced, being overlooked. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a notification from the DMV app. She smiled faintly as she clicked through the options, filing a DMV lock on the car. There was no turning back. The registration was frozen. His name was no longer on it. When the woman returned to the line, she spoke more softly, almost as if she understood the significance of the transfer. The transfer has been completed. The title is now in your trust. Is there anything else I can assist you with today, Mrs. Talbot? Marjorie took a deep breath. No, that will be all. She hung up and sat back, her hands gripping the edge of the table as the reality of what she'd just done settled over her like a warm blanket. It was the first real act of defiance, of reclaiming her life that had once felt so out of reach. A knock at the door broke the stillness. Dottie was standing there, as usual, a quiet smirk playing on her lips. What now? Marjorie, you're not done yet, are you? Marjorie met her gaze with a steady look. I'm just getting started. Dottie walked inside, crossing to the kitchen table where Marjorie had laid out her papers. Her eyes scanned the forms, a knowing look in her eyes as she saw the evidence of the changes. Eli's done his part, Marjorie said, her voice firm. The trust is in place. Blake won't have access to anything. Car, land, nothing. He's out. I'm starting fresh. Dottie raised an eyebrow. You doing this to punish him? No, Marjorie replied, her voice cool but with a trace of something deeper. I'm just finally treating him like he treated me. Dottie nodded slowly, her lips pressed into a thin line. Well, he deserves it. Marjorie let out a breath, the weight of everything that had happened settling into her bones. She could feel the pieces falling into place, her sense of self, her dignity, her future. It wasn't about revenge, not really. It was about taking back control, taking back her life. Outside, the sky was a blanket of deep purples and reds, the fading light signaling the end of one chapter. Blake thought he could walk away without consequence, without ever looking back. But Marjorie knew now that the next chapter was entirely hers to write, and she had no intention of leaving anything to chance. The phone buzzed once more, another text from Blake. Marjorie didn't even have to look at it. Marjorie heard the knock on the door before she had even made it to the window. There was a quiet urgency in it, an expectation she recognized well. Blake. He had shown up earlier than expected, which meant he was already panicking, already feeling the shift beneath him. The kind of panic she'd grown used to when he needed something, when his sense of entitlement flared up like a dangerous flame. She didn't move right away, though. Instead, she let the sound hang in the air for a moment, the silence that followed it like a challenge. Marjorie wasn't in a hurry anymore. Not to explain herself, not to apologize. She'd done enough of that over the years. Now it was his turn to wait. The knock came again, louder this time, a sharp demand. She walked slowly to the door, her steps measured. By the time her hand gripped the handle, she could already feel the familiar pressure in her chest, the tightness that had always come with him. His impatience, his assumption that he could walk through her life without boundaries. She opened the door just wide enough to see his face. Standing there in the cold evening light, hands shoved deep into his pockets, looking more disheveled than usual. His eyes were sharp, his posture stiff. He was angry, but trying to hide it behind a mask of forced calm. You're not going to make me beg, are you? Blake's voice was low but edged with an unmistakable arrogance. Marjorie didn't blink. She looked at him with a steadiness that caught him off guard. What do you want, Blake? His jaw tightened. He took a step forward, as if the threshold meant nothing to him anymore. I need the car. For errands. You know, like normal people do. Marjorie didn't step aside. She didn't even gesture for him to come in. The door remained between them, a barrier that felt more solid than the walls of the house ever had. She didn't need to invite him in. "The car is mine," she said, her voice flat, without the usual apology. "So are the errands." Blake's eyes widened, disbelief flashing across his face for just a moment. He had expected a fight, maybe an argument. Instead, she was calm, unmoving. "Seriously?" he scoffed, throwing his hands up. "Over one fight?" It was more than just one fight. It was years of disrespect, years of his entitlement and her silence. Marjorie could feel that truth settle in her chest like a weight she didn't mind carrying anymore. She didn't answer him. She didn't need to. He stood there for a moment, waiting for something. A reaction, a plea, maybe even an excuse. But there was nothing. She said nothing more. Marjorie simply stared at him, letting the silence fill the space between them. Her eyes didn't waver. His face twisted with confusion, then irritation. With a frustrated huff, he stepped back. His movements jerky and impatient, and he turned to walk away. But just before he reached the end of the driveway, Marjorie took a slow breath and closed the door, the soft click of it latching sounding more final than it ever had before. No slamming. No anger. Just the calm certainty that came from knowing this chapter was over. For a moment she stood there, her hand resting on the doorframe. A strange satisfaction crept over her. The tension she had carried for years, the fear that somehow she'd be wrong in choosing herself, gone. It was the smallest of victories, but it was hers. Later that afternoon, after the sun had set and the chill of the evening crept into the air, Marjorie stood in the entryway again, her fingers brushing over the keys of the ranch gate. She wasn't angry anymore. She didn't need to be. But she wasn't going to keep letting him think he could waltz back in whenever he wanted. She walked to the gate, her steps echoing through the empty yard. Blake's car was long gone, and the house was quiet again, still as it should be. With a soft grunt, she unlocked the gate, took a moment to remove the old lock, and replaced it with a fresh one. One she knew he couldn't break through, one that wouldn't open for him just because he knocked on it. She didn't even need to look back to know he wouldn't be able to get in without her permission. When she was done, she stood there for a long time, her gaze drifting over the land she'd worked for, the land that was finally hers to protect, hers to defend. The air felt different now. The weight of his expectations, his demands. They didn't have a hold on her anymore. It was a simple change. But it had shaken something loose inside her. The lock clicked into place with a satisfying finality. Marjorie didn't turn around immediately. For a long moment she just stood there, listening to the wind. She was done. She had drawn the line in the sand, and now it was up to him to figure out where he stood. And he would. He would. Eventually. But it wouldn't matter. She had already taken back what was hers. The wind had picked up by the time Marjorie stepped out onto the front porch. It swirled around her, carrying with it the scent of the dry earth and the faint tang of wood smoke from a distant neighbor's fireplace. It was a late afternoon now, the golden light of the setting sun casting long shadows across the yard, but Marjorie had only one thing on her mind. She took the notice from the pile on the table, holding it in her hands for a moment before pinning it to the post beside the front door with a firm, deliberate motion. She read the words aloud as she placed the thumbtack through the paper. Effective immediately. Residency rights reviewed. Contact legal counsel. There. It was done. The language was clean, professional, but there was no mistaking what it meant. Blake and Kendra were no longer welcome to think of this house as their home. It was a small act, but it resonated far beyond the few lines of text. It was a boundary drawn in permanent ink, one that had been a long time coming. She took a step back to admire her work, folding her arms across her chest as she surveyed the notice. This wasn't just about her decision to take control. It was a declaration, one that, like everything else she'd done in the past few weeks. Didn't need to be loud to be heard. The phone rang. Marjorie glanced at the screen. Kendra. Her finger hesitated for a moment before she swiped to answer. Kendra, Marjorie said, her voice steady, as if this conversation was nothing more than routine. Is this a joke? Kendra's voice was sharp, almost desperate. You can't be serious. Marjorie leaned back against the porch railing, her gaze drifting toward the horizon, where the sky had already begun to take on darker shades. She could hear the strain in Kendra's voice, the fear that their world was shifting beneath their feet. This isn't a joke, Marjorie replied. I've been more than patient, Kendra, but that's over now. I don't understand. We've lived here for years. Kendra's words came faster now, the panic rising with each syllable. We have every right to be here. Marjorie exhaled slowly. No, you don't. You've never had a lease. You've been living here informally. You've treated this place as if it was yours to take for granted, and that's over. Kendra started, but Marjorie didn't give her the chance to finish. You've had your chance to make things right, Marjorie interrupted, but you didn't. And now you're going to learn what real support looks like. There was silence on the other end of the line, a stunned quiet that stretched on for longer than it should have. Finally, Kendra spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Blake's going to be furious when he finds out. Marjorie let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Let him be. He'll figure it out. He always does. She hung up before Kendra could respond, feeling a strange kind of calm settle over her. It was as if a weight had lifted from her shoulders, a weight she hadn't even realized was there until now. For so long, she had been the one scrambling, the one who tiptoed around everyone else's needs, trying to smooth over their messes. Now, the roles had reversed. The phone buzzed again, this time with an email. Marjorie didn't need to check the sender's name to know it was Blake. She opened the message with the same calmness that had been with her all afternoon. Mom, I'm sorry for what I said. I was just upset. Please, let's talk. You know I didn't mean it. The words were predictably apologetic, almost too familiar now. Marjorie stared at the screen, reading them once, twice. They were empty words, the kind that always came when Blake needed to get himself out of a tight spot. There was no real remorse, no understanding of what he had done, only the panic of losing control. She felt a flicker of something, maybe pity, maybe just resignation. And then, just as quickly, she deleted the message. No more half-hearted apologies. No more pretending. Not from him. Not from anyone. Her phone buzzed again, but this time, it was Dottie calling. Did you post it? Dottie's voice came through, sharp with anticipation. Marjorie didn't need to ask what Dottie meant. It's up. You know he's going to flip out, right? Marjorie smiled to herself. Let him. I'm not worried about Blake's temper anymore. There was a pause on the other end, a beat of silence where Marjorie could almost hear Dottie's knowing grin. Well, he's not sorry, Dottie said, her voice low. He's scrambling. He wants to keep his place at the table. And he won't get it, Marjorie said, her voice firm. He lost that seat the moment he treated me like a burden. It's my turn now. As she hung up, the air felt a little colder, but she didn't mind. She stood up straighter, feeling the wind brush against her face. For the first time in a long while, she felt like she was on the right side of the equation. She had given Blake and Kendra every opportunity to change, to meet her halfway, and they hadn't. Now, they would learn the lesson she had been trying to teach them all along. It was quiet again, but this time, it was a silence that was hers to keep. She looked back at the posted notice, the words clear and unyielding, effective immediately. No turning back now. As the sun finally dipped behind the hills, Marjorie felt a small smile tug at her lips. There would be no more waiting. No more second guessing. The change had come, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. And as she turned toward the house, she knew she had made the right choice. This time, the burden of proof wasn't on her anymore. It was on them. Marjorie sat at the kitchen table, the hum of the overhead light above her a soft counterpoint to the silence of the house. The papers in front of her were neatly stacked, but there was an undeniable weight to each sheet. Her fingers hovered over the signature lines of the document she had just received from Eli, her longtime attorney. They weren't easy decisions, but they were necessary ones. She had given Blake and Kendra every chance, every grace, every excuse. But there was no more room for that now. No more bending, no more compromising. They had made their choice. And now, Marjorie was about to make hers. The land was hers. Always had been. She had paid off the mortgage years ago. A quiet, personal victory that Blake had never appreciated. He'd always assumed he would inherit everything. She could practically hear his voice now, full of certainty. It's all going to be mine anyway, right? But that wasn't how this was going to play out. Not anymore. She signed her name on the first document, the transfer of full ownership of the ranch, land, and all assets into a new, irrevocable trust. The words were clear, concise. The land, the house, the business. It was all officially under her control now. Blake had thought he could take it from her, that he could wait her out. But he was wrong. Marjorie paused for a moment. Her pen hovering over the next page, the update to her will. Blake and Kendra's names had once been there, a given, a legacy to pass down. But no longer. With a steady hand, she crossed them out. Removed them entirely from her future. It was time to stop pretending they would ever be the people she hoped they would be. The door opened behind her with a soft creak. She didn't need to look up. Dottie was never subtle in her entrance, but her presence in the doorway still gave Marjorie a sense of calm. Dottie had always been there, the friend who saw things as they were, who never pulled punches. They laughed when you said boundaries, Dottie remarked quietly, leaning against the doorframe. Let's see if they're laughing now. Marjorie didn't answer immediately. The truth in Dottie's words rang through her, sharp and undeniable. Blake and Kendra had laughed at her efforts to reclaim herself for years. They thought she was weak, too quiet, too willing to let them dictate the terms of her life. But that was changing. Slowly, but steadily, it was changing. I don't think they'll laugh again, Marjorie said, finally meeting Dottie's gaze. There was no bitterness in her voice, no regret, just clarity. Dottie nodded, her eyes flicking to the papers on the table. You've done the hard part. Now, you're just taking back what's yours. Marjorie signed the final page, her fingers still trembling slightly, though she wasn't sure if it was from exhaustion or exhilaration. It didn't matter. The work was done. She leaned back in her chair, feeling the weight of the decision settle into her bones. The phone buzzed on the counter, an unfamiliar number flashing across the screen. She picked it up, the sound of Eli's voice cutting through the static of the line. Marjorie, it's done. We've set up the trust. All assets have been rerouted to the educational funds for Zach and Molly. They'll be well taken care of, but the control is external, out of reach for Blake. You've just built a future your son can't touch. Marjorie's throat tightened as she absorbed the weight of those words. A future your son can't touch. It was the final step, the moment where she knew everything she had built would finally be protected. It wasn't about punishment, it was about preservation. I didn't want to have to do this, Eli, Marjorie said quietly, but I couldn't let them keep using me, keep taking everything for granted. I know, Eli said gently, but now you're free to decide what you do with the rest of it. You've made the right choice. She pressed her fingers against her temples, a small ache behind her eyes. The emotional toll was heavier than the legal weight of the decisions she had made, but she had no regrets. She couldn't afford any. She hung up the phone, turning to Dottie. Her friend's eyes were searching, soft but unwavering. "You did it, Marjorie," Dottie said simply. "You took everything back." Marjorie looked out the window, the late afternoon light now fading, casting the ranch in cool shades of blue and gray. The house, the land, everything was hers. And as she watched the darkening horizon, she realized that the battle wasn't over, not by a long shot. But she no longer felt like the victim in it. For the first time in years, Marjorie felt in control of her own future. Her phone buzzed again. Another email from Blake. Her eyes flicked over the words. "Mom, please. This has gone too far. We can work this out. Just let me come home and fix things." Marjorie didn't even need to read it. She already knew what it would say. The same plea for forgiveness. The same empty request to come back to the way things were. She deleted it without a second thought. The door creaked open again, and this time Marjorie did look up. Dottie stood there, her arms crossed, her eyes full of knowing. "Are you ready for what comes next?" she asked softly. Marjorie stood up slowly, her hands steady as she ran them over the table, over the documents, over everything she had just done. She felt lighter somehow, stronger. "Let's see if Blake still thinks he's entitled to my life," Marjorie said, her voice calm but firm. "I'm done letting him decide who I am." The clock ticked on, but it no longer mattered. Marjorie had learned the hard way that time didn't wait for anyone, and now she was the one who controlled it. And this time, the clock was ticking in her favor. The knock was quiet, tentative, as if Kendra wasn't sure whether she wanted to be here, but had no other choice. Marjorie had heard it from the kitchen, the same soft tap-tap that had echoed 100 times over the years, but this time it wasn't the sound of someone seeking help. It was the sound of someone who had lost their way. She stood at the window for a long moment, watching the figure through the sheer curtains. Kendra. Her silhouette was thin, arms crossed in front of her, her shoulders stiff. Marjorie didn't rush to the door. There was no hurry anymore. When she finally opened it, Kendra's face was flushed, eyes swollen like she hadn't slept in days. The anger that had once defined her had all but faded, replaced by something much more vulnerable. Fear. "We didn't mean to push you that far," Kendra said, her voice thick with unshed tears. "You have to know that. We never meant to make you feel like you had no choice." Marjorie's gaze didn't soften. There was no room for softness anymore. She had been patient, forgiving even, for years. She had given them all the chances they would ever get. But now, standing before her, Kendra looked more like a stranger than ever. "You didn't push me, Kendra," Marjorie said, her voice low and even. "You threw me out of a moving life." Kendra's lips trembled, the words caught in her throat. She had always been good at pretending, at weaving a web of words that made everything sound better than it was. But Marjorie wasn't buying it anymore. "I didn't want things to go like this," Kendra continued, stepping forward slightly. "I swear I didn't. But the kids, Blake, they'll be devastated. They'll hate me." Marjorie stood perfectly still, watching her. Her hands, though calm, ached to do something to finally show Blake and Kendra that their actions had consequences, that no amount of manipulation would work anymore. But she didn't move. "They'll be devastated?" Marjorie's voice was sharp, cutting through the air between them. "Then teach them not to inherit cruelty." The words hung in the air between them, stark and heavy. Kendra flinched as if slapped, but there was no turning back now. Marjorie had no more room for false apologies, for hollow promises. Her heart had long since grown numb to the cycle of it all. Blake and Kendra had made their choices, and now it was her turn to make hers. Kendra's eyes darted to the floor, her breath shaky as she fought back more tears. I thought we could work it out. Marjorie, I thought if I just made you see that it wasn't all their fault. No. Marjorie cut her off, her words ringing in the air with finality. It's not about what you thought. It's about what you did. You both showed me who you are, and I can't unsee that. Kendra stood there for a long moment, her face crumpled, hands hanging limply at her sides. She looked lost, but Marjorie wasn't going to offer her any solace. Not this time. Kendra sniffled, wiped her eyes, and finally straightened up. The anger, the frustration, it returned quickly, as though she had been wearing it like a second skin all along. You're not going to win, Marjorie. You're pushing everyone away, and when you're alone, don't come running to us. Marjorie didn't flinch. She didn't respond. She simply turned and started to close the door. The slow, deliberate motion giving Kendra no room to argue, no chance to try and make her feel guilty. Just before the door clicked shut, Kendra let out a final, sharp, "You'll regret this." Marjorie didn't answer. She closed the door quietly, the sound of the latch locking a quiet punctuation to the conversation. The space around her felt suddenly bigger, emptier. The ranch, which had once felt like a prison of obligations, now stretched out before her like an expanse of possibilities. She stood there for a long moment, her back against the door, absorbing the silence, the weight of everything she had just said, and everything she had done. And then, slowly, she walked back into the house. She picked up the community bulletin she had been working on earlier, feeling the weight of her decision settle deeper into her bones. Looking to rent out newly available ranch space. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of the future. It was her move now. Her finger hovered over the post button. The house was changing, the land was changing, and she was changing. Blake and Kendra would learn soon enough that she wasn't the woman they had always taken for granted. And with one soft click, she posted the notice. There was no going back now. As Marjorie leaned back in her chair, she finally allowed herself a breath. The hard part was over. Whatever came next, she would face it on her own terms. The phone buzzed again. She looked at the screen. Blake. She stared at the name, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel the need to answer. Her future had already been written, and it had nothing to do with them. The voicemail blinked on her phone screen. Blake's voice, a thin thread of desperation, rippled through the quiet of the house. Marjorie stared at it for a long moment, the weight of the past days pressing on her shoulders. She had already heard everything he had to say. His words had lost their meaning, their power. But she listened to it anyway. "Mom, please. I can't fix this alone. You have to know that I never meant to hurt you. I'll do whatever it takes. Please, just let me back in." She pressed play again. The same words, but they didn't hit the same anymore. The plea for forgiveness, the sound of him unraveling, it was just noise. A reminder of the person she'd let herself be for far too long. She hit delete without a second thought, and for a moment she simply stared at the screen, feeling a strange mixture of sadness and relief. The last tie had been severed. The silence that followed was nothing like it had been before. This time, it was hers. No more waiting. No more pretending. Marjorie put the phone down and turned toward the window. The view of the ranch spread out before her, the land hers in every sense, and yet the weight of it felt lighter than it ever had. She had taken control, but the emptiness remained, a void she hadn't expected. She had fought for so long to find her own space, but now that she had it, there was something unsettling about the quiet. She snapped out of it, focusing on the task at hand. She had posted the community bulletin earlier, but now there was another matter that needed attention. A tenant. The cottage had sat vacant for too long, and she knew it was time to make a change. She picked up the phone and called the number that had been left on the rental listing. It was a woman, soft-spoken but with a quiet strength in her voice. Her name was Eleanor, and she was a widow with a young daughter. Marjorie arranged a meeting for later that afternoon, hoping that this new arrangement would offer them both what they needed: a fresh start, a place to rebuild, just like herself. By dusk, Eleanor and her daughter had moved in. Marjorie watched them from the window of her own home, the mother and daughter settling into the cottage, the warmth of their first night together radiating through the small window. A quiet satisfaction filled Marjorie, though it wasn't without a tinge of something else. Hope, maybe. The idea that people could heal, start fresh, and find what they needed, just as she had. Later, as the house grew darker, she walked into the study and sat down at her desk. The letter had arrived that morning, and now she held it in her hands. Molly's letter. "Why won't you visit anymore?" It was simple, direct, the kind of question that only children ask when they sense something is missing. The pain of it stung, but Marjorie didn't look away. The weight of motherhood, of family, wasn't lost on her, even now. She took her pen, the smooth ink flowing with a quiet finality. She wrote, "Because love is loud, and I was treated with silence." She paused, staring at the words, letting them settle into the space around her. It wasn't an easy thing to write, but it was the truth. The truth she had been too afraid to admit to herself for years. After a moment, she added something else. Something more tangible. A gift card. A book. The words came easily this time. "Find your voice." She sealed the envelope carefully, feeling the cool weight of it in her hands, before placing it into the outgoing mail pile. There was a knock at the door. Marjorie walked over and opened it to find Dottie standing there, her arms crossed, her gaze steady as always. "Did you send it?" Dottie asked, her voice low, the hint of something unspoken in the air between them. "I did," Marjorie said, her voice quiet but firm. "It's time to start leaving the lessons, not the bitterness." Dottie smiled, her eyes softening. "That's the hardest part, isn't it? Letting go of the anger but not forgetting the lessons." Marjorie nodded. "The hardest part is learning when to stop being the one who holds it all together. They can't break me anymore." Dottie stepped inside, glancing out the window at the cottage in the distance where Eleanor and her daughter were already making their new life. "You've made a lot of changes," Dottie said, her voice warm. "But don't forget, you're building something now. Something that can't be taken from you." Marjorie smiled, feeling the weight of Dottie's words settle in her chest. She turned back to the window, looking out at the empty space, at the quiet house. "Yes," Marjorie said, almost to herself. "I'm building it. And this time, it's mine." The silence that followed felt different now. It wasn't the absence of sound, it was the space for something new, something she had created. She had drawn the line, and now, it was her future waiting for her. No more apologies, no more empty promises. Just her, and the life she was going to reclaim. And in the distance, the faintest hint of a new beginning. The interview was set for the following week, and Marjorie sat in the small, cluttered office of the local newspaper, a cup of lukewarm coffee beside her, the scent of printer ink thick in the air. She'd been hesitant at first, unsure if she wanted to make her story public. But now, looking at the reporter across from her, she felt an odd sense of relief. It wasn't the kind of relief that came from any apology or explanation. It was the relief that came from finally, fully, owning her truth. The reporter, a young woman with glasses perched low on her nose, clicked her pen nervously as she adjusted the recorder between them. Marjorie had agreed to speak to her on the condition that her words wouldn't be edited down to sound bites. "Tell me what happened, Marjorie," the reporter said, her voice kind but probing. How did you get to this point? Marjorie took a slow breath, her eyes tracing the edges of the desk. She wasn't nervous anymore, not like she used to be. There was no uncertainty in her as she spoke. She had already made peace with every decision she'd made. It's simple, she began, her voice steady. For years, I was treated like I didn't matter. Like my needs, my boundaries, my voice didn't count. I spent my life tiptoeing around other people's expectations, trying to be the mother, the wife, the daughter they wanted me to be. And in the process, I forgot who I was. She leaned forward slightly, her fingers resting on the table, the weight of her words hanging between them. It wasn't one moment or one fight. It was years of disrespect. Years of my son thinking he could control everything, thinking he could take whatever he wanted from me. And for a long time, I let him. But I wasn't a burden. I was a builder. I built a life, a house, a family. I'm not a doormat to be walked over. The reporter's eyes widened slightly, taking in the clarity in Marjorie's words. It sounds like there was a breaking point. Marjorie's gaze grew distant for a moment, as if she was reliving that pivotal day on the side of the road, Blake tossing the keys to the car at her like they were worthless. She nodded slowly. The breaking point wasn't just when I was thrown out of the car. It was when I realized I had been letting them use me for years. I realized that I wasn't just being disrespected. I was complicit in it. I allowed them to treat me like I was invisible. But no more. I'm done being quiet. The words felt like the first breath of fresh air she'd taken in years. The reporter typed rapidly, capturing every word. How does it feel, though? To go public with this? Marjorie paused for a moment, considering the question. It's freeing, she said simply. It's scary, too, but it's freeing. I've spent so much of my life keeping things to myself, keeping the peace, because that's what was expected of me. But now I'm speaking up. I'm reclaiming my life, my voice, and my story. And that feels like power. The interview wrapped up an hour later. The reporter thanked her, promising that the piece would be on the front page in the morning. Marjorie left the office feeling lighter than she had in years. There was no turning back now. Her story was out there, for anyone who wanted to hear it. The article went viral in the region, spreading like wildfire across social media, from local groups to larger forums focused on women's rights and elder care. The headline was blunt and empowering. I wasn't a burden. I was a builder. Comments flooded in, mostly supportive. Some shared their own stories of breaking free from toxic family dynamics. Others thanked her for her bravery, for being the voice they never had. Marjorie found herself reading the comments in the quiet of her home, smiling faintly at the women who were finding their strength in her words. There were a few who didn't understand, who labeled her selfish, heartless, and cold. But she didn't dwell on those. The others, the ones who thanked her, were enough. As she scrolled, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text from Blake. She could already hear the tone in his words without even reading them. Are you seriously going public with this? The question was loaded with judgment, with a deep sense of disbelief that she would do such a thing. But Marjorie didn't hesitate. She smiled, her fingers steady as she typed her response. You made it public when you opened the car door and told me to walk. Her finger hovered over the send button for a moment. There was a slight tremor in her hand, not from fear or uncertainty, but from something else, from the release of holding back for so long. She pressed send. The silence in the house felt different now. It wasn't empty. It wasn't oppressive. It was a quiet victory, one that had been a long time coming. She stood up, her eyes drifting to the window where the light from the setting sun cast long shadows across the yard. The land, the house, everything was hers again. And this time, she was going to protect it. Not just from Blake, but from anyone who thought they could take from her without consequence. And as the door clicked shut behind her, the first real step into her new future began. The letter arrived in a plain envelope, the handwriting on the front familiar but distant. Marjorie turned it over in her hands, staring at the address, at the penmanship that could have been her son's, if not for the weight of everything that had happened. She didn't open it right away. She already knew what was inside. She could feel the emptiness of the words without even having read them. Blake. She set the envelope on the kitchen counter, the paper smooth beneath her fingers, its edges sharp with finality. For a long moment she did nothing but watch the paper, waiting for something to feel different. But nothing came. Finally, she opened it, tearing the seal with a single motion, as though she were opening the last chapter of a book she'd long ago decided to put down. The letter was full of words like regret, reconciliation, moving forward, a soft plea for forgiveness, the kind that had always felt like a lifeline, only this time, it was empty. No specifics. Just a vague apology, a promise that wasn't backed by anything tangible. It was a manipulation dressed in the language of healing. Marjorie read it through once, then twice. The words stung only because they reminded her of what she had already lost. The plea for things to go back to the way they were wasn't a request for change. It was just another way to hold on to control. The same pattern, the same manipulation, the same lack of accountability. She placed the letter down, her eyes never leaving the words. Eli's voice echoed in her mind, his earlier words cutting through her thoughts. "I told you he'd try this," he had said, a smirk in his voice when he read the first apology. No mention of specifics, just manipulation. The truth of that hit harder than any of his apologies ever could. She didn't need to read the rest. She didn't need to entertain it anymore. She wasn't the person she used to be, the person who waited for apologies that would never come. Not this time. With one smooth motion, she folded the letter back up and placed it back into the envelope, sealing it with the same finality she had used to close the door on him that day by the side of the road. This time, she wasn't holding on to anything. No memories, no regrets. Just peace. Marjorie turned to the corner of the kitchen where her laptop sat, its screen a quiet reflection of the world outside. Her fingers hesitated over the keys. She had been thinking about this for weeks, the idea of writing her thoughts, sharing her journey with others. A way to rebuild herself, a way to build something new. She opened a new document, her fingers striking the keys with a sense of urgency, as though the words were already there, waiting for her to find them. She titled the blog, "Late Blooms, Boundaries for the Overlooked." A simple title, but one that carried a deep truth for Marjorie. She had been overlooked for too long. And now, she would not only make herself seen, but heard. Her first post flowed easily, the words spilling out in a way they hadn't before. She wrote about what it meant to be silenced, to put everyone else's needs before your own until you forget how to ask for anything for yourself. She wrote about reclaiming her life, her property, her worth. She clicked publish with a deep breath, not knowing who would see it or how far it would reach. But it didn't matter. She had finally spoken her truth, and that was enough. Within hours, the post had taken off. Comments flooded in from people she didn't know, from women who had been in the same place she had. Quiet, invisible, unnoticed. Messages poured in from retirement groups, elder rights forums, and women's empowerment pages, all sharing their own stories of finding their voices. Marjorie read each one, a small smile tugging at her lips as she realized she wasn't alone. The blog continued to grow, each post bringing more readers, more comments, more women who understood. They were reclaiming their power in small, quiet ways, just like her. Then, just as she was closing the laptop, another message popped up in her inbox. This one was from Zach. His name on the screen made her heart stutter in a way she hadn't expected. The subject line read, "I'm sorry. I'm trying to do better than them." She opened the message, her fingers trembling slightly as she read the short note. "I know I haven't always been the best, and I didn't understand before. But I see things now. I see you now. I'm sorry. I'm trying to do better than them. I want to be better." The words landed heavy in her chest. For a moment, she wasn't sure what to feel. This was the son she had hoped for, the one who had always been buried under layers of bitterness and entitlement. It wasn't a perfect apology, but it was an acknowledgement, a recognition of the way he had hurt her. Marjorie closed her eyes for a moment, the weight of everything pressing in around her. She had spent so long carrying the weight of his expectations, his anger, and now there was a flicker of something different, something hopeful, but uncertain. She replied simply, "I see you too." She hit send, and for the first time in years, the silence in the house didn't feel empty. It felt full of possibility. Her phone buzzed again, but this time she wasn't afraid of it. This time, she was in control. The future was her own. And whatever came next, she was ready. The clock ticked on. The ballroom was dimly lit, the kind of soft glow that made everything feel like it was trapped in a memory, a moment suspended between before and after. Marjorie adjusted the strap of her deep navy dress, its fabric smooth against her skin, and looked around the room. The chatter, the clink of silverware, the shuffle of footsteps, all felt distant, muffled. She wasn't sure why she'd agreed to come to this dinner in the first place. She wasn't one for grand gestures or being the center of attention. But tonight, she had been invited to accept an award, and though the weight of it had pressed down on her all week, there was no turning back now. Dottie was standing beside her, as always, a quiet presence of steady reassurance. She was wearing her usual knowing smile, though tonight there was a hint of something else in her eyes. A kind of pride, maybe, or maybe just relief that Marjorie had reached this point. "You're going to be fine," Dottie said, her voice low and sure. "No more apologies. You're here because you earned it." Marjorie offered a tight smile, but the truth was, she wasn't sure she had. This wasn't about an award. Not really. It wasn't even about recognition. This dinner, this ceremony, it was just another small step toward a life that no longer revolved around Blake, Kendra, or anyone else who had used her. The host called for the honorees to step forward, and Marjorie felt the familiar tightening in her chest. She hadn't prepared a speech. There was no script, no formal words to memorize. She didn't need them. All she had to do was stand there and speak her truth. As simple as that. When it was her turn, she walked up to the podium with steady steps. The room quieted, the air hanging heavy with expectation. She could feel the weight of all the eyes on her, but for the first time in a long time, she didn't shrink from it. She stood tall, her shoulders squared, her head held high. The microphone clicked, and for a moment, Marjorie let the silence fill the space between her and the crowd. She took a deep breath and began, her voice clear and firm. "Respect isn't generational," she said, her words ringing out across the room. "It's earned." The words were simple, but they were everything. Her heart raced, but she didn't flinch. She could feel Dottie's eyes on her, could sense the soft nod of approval in the air. The weight of the years she had spent apologizing, shrinking, and bending to others was finally lifting, and with every word she spoke, it became more and more apparent. She didn't need forgiveness from anyone anymore. She had earned this moment. A soft murmur went through the room, and a few heads nodded. It wasn't applause yet, but Marjorie didn't care. She didn't need to hear their validation. She had already found it in herself. Dottie's voice cut through the stillness, barely audible, but full of emotion. "You said it plain. Finally." Marjorie didn't respond. She didn't need to. The truth was already out there. And now, there was nothing left to hide. The ceremony moved on, the other honorees speaking their lines with practiced ease. But Marjorie felt like she was drifting in a different current now. She wasn't part of their world anymore, not in the way they thought she was. She had stepped out of it, a quiet rebellion against everything she had been taught to accept. After the speeches were over, as the guests mingled, a city official approached her. A man in a sharp suit who exuded that unmistakable air of importance. Marjorie had seen him around at various community events, but had never had a reason to engage with him before. "Mrs. Talbot," he said, offering her a hand. "I just wanted to personally thank you for sharing your story. It's inspiring to see someone take ownership of their life in such a public way. We need more voices like yours." Marjorie shook his hand, her fingers steady, the familiar weight of his handshake a small reminder of how far she had come. "Thank you," she replied simply. "We'd like to offer you a consulting role in elder education," he said, his voice softening with a touch of respect now. "Your insights could make a real difference. We could use someone with your experience." Marjorie paused, considering it for a moment. The offer was significant, yes, but it wasn't the title that mattered. It was the work. It was the chance to build something meaningful, something that would help others find their voices. "I'd be honored," she said, her voice calm but with an undeniable strength underneath it. I said yes. I've got more to say. The man smiled and handed her a business card, but Marjorie barely registered the details. She was already looking past him, already thinking about what would come next. She wasn't just a recipient of an award tonight. She was an architect of her own future. As the night drew to a close, Marjorie found herself back at her table, Dottie sitting beside her. The room had begun to empty, the buzz of conversations fading into the background, but the hum in her chest, the quiet pulse of her own power, was loud. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. Another text from Blake. She glanced at it, her finger hovering over the screen. His words read, "Hope it was worth the attention." A flicker of something, irritation maybe, stirred in her chest, but she simply shook her head and deleted the message without hesitation. It was the same tone, the same dismissal. Marjorie looked out over the room where shadows from the evening light stretched across the polished floor. There was nothing left for her in those old expectations, in those old patterns. Not anymore. She was no longer just playing the role that had been written for her. She was writing her own. The future was open now, and it was hers. The late afternoon sun filtered through the window, casting long, soft shadows across the office as Marjorie sat at her desk, signing the final piece of paperwork. She had been working with Eli for weeks, solidifying the plan that would protect her legacy. It wasn't just about wealth or property. It was about what she left behind, what she chose to build after everything had been torn down. The legacy she would leave would not only be one of survival, but of empowerment. The donation she had made earlier in the year to fund transitional housing for displaced elders was finally coming to fruition. A project that had started as an idea, a whisper of what she could offer to others who had been treated the way she had, was now becoming a reality. Marjorie picked up the dedication plaque from her desk, running her fingers over the words engraved into the metal. For those who were told to walk home. She felt a strange pang as she looked at it. It wasn't just a plaque. It was a testament to everything she had overcome, everything she had turned into something meaningful. The land, the ranch, the house. These were no longer symbols of what had been taken from her. They were the foundation for what she was giving to others. She stood up, the quiet weight of the plaque in her hands grounding her. It was more than a physical structure. The house, the space, These were places where people like her, like so many others, could find safety, dignity, and a fresh start. No one would be told to walk home again. Not under her watch. As she made her way to the front door, Dottie was waiting for her in the hallway. Dottie had become a constant in Marjorie's life, her grounding presence always there when it mattered most. "You've built something real, Marjorie," Dottie said, her voice low with respect. "You've built something that can't be broken." Marjorie smiled, though it was tinged with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had fought for too long to be knocked down again. "I don't know about that," she said, placing the plaque in the front hallway, where it would be the first thing people saw when they entered the space. "But I've built something that matters, something that will give people what I never had." Dottie followed her into the front room, where a few old chairs were arranged around a small coffee table. It wasn't much, but it was enough. This was where Marjorie would begin her weekly writing circles, a space for the women in her community who had felt invisible, unheard, silenced. They would come here, write their stories, and find their voices. The room quickly filled with chairs as more and more women signed up. Marjorie had expected a few, maybe a handful, but each week more faces appeared, all looking for a place to share their stories. The writing circles were never about just writing, they were about breaking the silence, building something out of the pieces of their lives that had been scattered by years of neglect. These women weren't just participants, they were collaborators in their own healing, their own reclamation. The community came together in ways that surprised Marjorie. She didn't know, when she started, that this would be the thing that filled her heart. Not the legacy of the land, not the money, not the business, but the people. The conversations that unfolded around that coffee table were the conversations she had been denied for so long, the raw, honest words that broke through all the pretense. Later that week, Eli called to finalize the legal documents that would secure her legacy for good. With a few signatures, the last of Blake and Kendra's names were removed from the will, their access to her assets permanently severed. It felt almost anticlimactic after everything that had happened, but there was peace in it too. It wasn't about vengeance, it was about protection, about ensuring that no one could come in and take what she had worked so hard to build. Marjorie looked down at the stack of papers in front of her. With a final stroke of her pen, it was all done. The land, the house, the future. Secure and untouchable. But more than that, the work she had begun here was now set to grow. It would outlive her. It would continue long after she was gone. She stood up, feeling the weight of it all for the first time that day. Her legacy was no longer about a man's control over her life. It was about what she had given the world, about what she had made for those who had nowhere else to turn. And yet, as she looked out over the ranch, the phone buzzed on the counter. Another message from Zach. It had been weeks since their last conversation, and she hadn't expected to hear from him again. But there it was. "I'm sorry. I didn't know how much I had hurt you. I didn't understand before, but I see it now. I want to do better. I want to be better. I hope I haven't lost you." Marjorie sat back down, the message hanging in front of her. She read it through, her heart heavy but not broken. This wasn't an easy fix. This wasn't an easy conversation, but it was a start. It was a step forward. She typed back simply, "I see you too." The words felt weighty, final, but also full of possibility. Maybe there was a future for them both, one where they didn't need to erase the past, but could finally start from something real. With a deep breath, Marjorie set the phone down and turned her gaze to the window. The sky was darkening, but she wasn't afraid of it. She had built this life, this house, this land, this future, and she wasn't walking away from it. Her phone buzzed again, But this time, she wasn't afraid to answer. The future, after all, was hers to shape. And she was just getting started. Marjorie sat at the edge of the witness stand, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The room around her felt smaller than it should have, the walls closing in as the room filled with unfamiliar faces. The long table in front of her, lined with attorneys and experts, was intimidating, but she didn't flinch. She was no longer afraid of spaces like this. She had taken control of her life, and this moment would not be any different. The hearing room was packed with people, many of them there because of her testimony on elder abuse and financial neglect. It wasn't the first time she'd spoken out, but it was the first time her words carried weight that could reach beyond the room. The air was thick with anticipation. There were reporters in the back corner, their notebooks poised, cameras focused on her. Marjorie took a deep breath, adjusting the microphone in front of her, her fingers steady, though her pulse raced in her chest. She had waited years for this moment, not for validation or recognition, but for the chance to be heard, to speak the truth about what had been done to her, and so many others, behind closed doors. She leaned forward slightly, her voice calm, but every word carrying the weight of everything she had been through. I stand before you today as someone who was told, repeatedly, that I didn't matter, she began, her voice unwavering. As someone who was made to feel invisible by the very people who should have been there to support me. She paused for a moment, letting the words settle in the room, feeling the gravity of what she was saying. For years, my son thought he could control me, manipulate me, and take what he wanted because he thought he deserved it. Because he was his mother's son, she continued, her voice steady but sharp with the sting of truth. And I let him. For too long, I allowed him to break me down, to silence me, and to make me feel like I owed him everything. I wasn't just disrespected. I was used. And I'm not the only one. There are so many people in this room who know exactly what I mean. She could feel the room shift around her. Some leaned forward. Others sat back in their chairs. Some held their pens still, eyes locked on her, while others scribbled notes furiously. But none of it mattered. Marjorie wasn't speaking for them. She was speaking for herself, and for everyone who had ever been overlooked. The system fails us, Marjorie continued, her voice now rising with the quiet passion she had held for so long. It fails the elderly. It fails those who are vulnerable, and it fails when we allow one person, one family member, to control everything, to steal the dignity, the peace, the rights of someone who worked their entire life to have the freedom to make their own choices. Financial abuse is real. Emotional abuse is real. It is happening in homes across this country. It happens because the system allows it to happen. The room was completely silent now. Marjorie could feel the weight of every gaze in the room, but she didn't let it falter her. Her words were no longer just hers. They were for the women, the men, the families who had lived in the shadows of shame for too long. She wasn't just telling her story. She was giving them a voice, too. People like me, she continued, we're expected to just give and give, to accept what's handed to us, to endure abuse because we're supposed to be grateful. And when we speak up, when we stand up for ourselves, we're told we're being selfish. I'm here to tell you, self-care is not selfish. Boundaries are not selfish. And when you teach someone how to treat you, when you teach them that your dignity is not up for grabs, that is not selfish. That is survival. A single tear slipped down her cheek, but she wiped it away quickly, not wanting to lose herself in the emotion. She had shed enough tears for the things she had lost. This was not about that anymore. The people who tried to break me, my son, my daughter-in-law, they thought they could take everything I had. But I didn't just survive. I built something new. I built something stronger than they could ever take. And now, I'm here to share it with the world. The room was still, The reporters were motionless, their pens hovering in midair, unsure whether to write or listen, not knowing what to capture, because every word Marjorie spoke was already a headline in its own right. Her testimony, raw and poised, had exposed the truth that so many had turned away from for so long. She had turned the shame into a tool for justice. It wasn't about revenge. It was about truth. It was about standing up and saying enough. As Marjorie finished her testimony, the room slowly began to stir. The sound of pages turning, the murmurs of people exchanging glances, the click of cameras capturing every moment. It was the moment that would define her future. And, in a way, the moment that would define others' futures too. Later that week, the media picked up the story. The headline hit the local news: "The woman who was told to walk, then walked away for good." The article went viral, flooding social media with comments from people who had experienced the same kind of abuse, from people who felt seen for the first time. Marjorie's name was everywhere. It was strange, but it was also undeniable. She had never wanted this kind of attention, but it had found her because her truth was too loud to ignore. Her blog saw a surge in readers, and she began to receive messages from people all over the country. The most profound message came from a woman in a retirement group who thanked Marjorie for helping her realize that she wasn't alone, that she, too, could start over. Marjorie sat at her desk reading the messages, feeling a warm satisfaction rise within her. This was the work. This was the legacy she was building. Not just the land, not just the house, but the knowledge that her story had sparked a change in someone else. Her phone buzzed again. Another text from Blake. "Hope it was worth the attention." Marjorie didn't even look at it. She deleted it without hesitation, her finger steady on the screen. "You didn't just close the door," Dottie had said earlier, her voice thick with emotion. "You rebuilt the damn house." Marjorie smiled at the memory and looked out the window at the ranch. "And put the locks where I could reach them," she whispered softly to herself, a quiet laugh escaping her lips. The future was no longer uncertain. It was her own to shape, and she was finally, truly, free. The bookstore was packed, the buzz of conversation a gentle hum as Marjorie made her way through the line of eager readers. The book in her hand was more than just a collection of words. It was the physical manifestation of everything she had fought for, everything she had rebuilt. The book was her truth, her journey, her voice made permanent. She signed each copy with care, the pen gliding smoothly across the pages, each signature a final seal of a life reclaimed. When the line began to thin, she noticed him. Blake. He stood near the back of the crowd, his posture stiff, eyes scanning the room like he wasn't sure whether to approach or turn around and leave. His presence cut through the hum of the bookstore, pulling her attention like a magnet. He hadn't changed much, still wearing the same polished, practiced smile that used to smooth over his every flaw. He was holding a copy of her book, his fingers wrapped around it like it was a life raft, something to grab onto. Marjorie felt a tightening in her chest, but she didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She had lived through the noise of his demands and manipulations for far too long to be startled now. He approached the table slowly, taking his place in the line of readers. When it was his turn, he stepped forward with a measured calm. "That was a great talk," Blake said, his voice cool, but there was an edge to it, a hidden challenge behind the words. He was trying to appear unaffected, but Marjorie could see the cracks beneath his surface. The mask wasn't as solid as it used to be. She didn't answer immediately, her gaze flicking to the book in his hands. The irony wasn't lost on her. The book he had once dismissed, the one he had thought would never see the light of day, was now in his hands. A symbol of everything he had underestimated. She smiled faintly as she picked up the next book to sign, her pen moving quickly across the page. For those finding their way out, she wrote. It was simple, but it meant everything. Her voice, her words, had already done what they were meant to do. She wasn't here for approval. She wasn't here for him. Blake watched her as she signed, his eyes locked on the smooth motion of her hand. But there was no warmth in his gaze. He didn't see her anymore, not the woman who had fought for everything she had, not the woman who had stood up for herself in a world that had long expected her silence. He only saw the version of her that still lived in his head, someone who existed to make his life easier, to be molded to his will. She placed the signed book in front of him, her fingers brushing against the cool paper. When she looked up, their eyes met, and for the first time in years, she didn't see him as her son. She didn't see him as the person she had once tried so hard to understand. She saw him for what he was now, a man who had chosen his path, and a man who was no longer a part of hers. He opened his mouth, as though to say something more, but the words stalled in his throat. His expression faltered, his eyes flicking down to the book in his hands. Marjorie waited, but only for a moment. The silence between them was long and thick, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was final. Without another word, Blake walked away, the sound of his footsteps fading into the background as he moved to the next person in line. The weight of his presence lingered for a few seconds more, but Marjorie didn't feel it like she used to. There was no ache, no longing, no desire to make things right. There was just an understanding that some things couldn't be fixed, some people couldn't be saved. Dottie had been standing off to the side, quietly observing, as she always did. As Blake walked away, she met Marjorie's gaze. There was no need for words. Dottie had seen the change too, the change in Marjorie, the change in Blake. She didn't need to comment on it. The look in her eyes said it all. "Closure?" Dottie asked, her voice gentle but knowing as she approached the table. Marjorie shook her head, her lips curving into a smile that was both serene and certain. No, just finality. She didn't need to explain further. Dottie understood. She had seen Marjorie go through the years of struggle, the self-doubt, the years of being trampled by the weight of expectations and demands. And now, she was free of it. The relationship that had defined so much of her life had ended, not with a dramatic confrontation, but with the quiet finality of a door closing. Marjorie stood up, feeling a lightness she hadn't known in years. The event was winding down, but she wasn't done. She wasn't walking away from the work she'd begun. The future, as always, was in her hands, the car keys she once carried, those she would not let Blake take again. She was the one in control now. Dottie fell into step beside her as they headed toward the exit. "You ready to go?" she asked, her voice a soft hum of familiarity. Marjorie smiled, a real smile this time. "Yes," she said, her voice steady. "Sure. I'm driving myself home, and I'm keeping the keys this time." Dottie laughed, her eyes twinkling with approval. As they walked together toward the parking lot, Marjorie felt the weight of the past lift entirely. She had put in the work. She had rebuilt the house. And now, she was living in it. The car was hers. The keys were hers. And as the engine roared to life, Marjorie gripped the steering wheel, looking ahead, knowing that the road ahead was hers to chart. And this time, there were no obstacles in her way. The car hummed softly beneath Marjorie as she drove through the familiar roads. The landscape of her life unfolding before her, yet nothing about it felt familiar anymore. The past months had shifted everything, and as she maneuvered the wheel with an ease she hadn't known she was capable of, she realized how much had changed without her even noticing it. The land, the house, the work. It was all hers now. More than just property or a place to live. It was the foundation she had rebuilt herself upon. Today was her last workshop of the season, a small group of women had gathered, all seeking something Marjorie had long fought for: space, time, and the ability to speak their truths without fear of being silenced. It was fitting, in a way, that she would end the season here, on the cusp of everything that had come to pass, with her final act of offering her trust, literally and figuratively, to the women who would carry it forward. Marjorie had spent years not just teaching them how to write, but how to reclaim their stories, to claim back the silence that had been forced upon them. Today, she wasn't just teaching them, she was leaving behind a part of herself. She had signed the last of the trust documents the night before, and now, for each of them, she handed over a copy, the legacy of her hard work and reclaimed voice. "You are the ones who will make this real," she told them, as they gathered around the table, their pens poised and their eyes bright with the potential of their own futures. "Take this and build. Build something stronger than anything that was taken from you, because your voice, your life, your power, no one can take that from you unless you let them." When the workshop was over and the last woman had shaken her hand with gratitude, Marjorie stepped outside, the cool autumn air greeting her. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting a golden glow over the fields. She turned the car back on, the engine rumbling beneath her as she drove past the ranch, her ranch, where two elderly women and their grandchildren had already moved into the cottage she had once considered vacant for too long. The sight of them, their lives unfolding within the walls she had fought so hard to preserve, filled Marjorie with a quiet satisfaction. The ranch wasn't just hers anymore. It was becoming a home again. She looked at the padlock that gleamed in the sunlight, catching a glimpse of her name on the deed, etched and permanent, like the decision to finally take control of her life. It wasn't just a name on paper. It was the symbol of her survival, her strength, and her future. Turning down the road toward the Iron Kettle Diner, Marjorie's fingers gripped the steering wheel with a sense of finality. She had driven this road countless times, but today it felt different. It felt like the last time she would ever drive through it with any kind of hesitation, like the future was wide open before her, and she was no longer waiting for something to change. She had already changed everything she needed to. When she parked outside the diner, the scent of fresh pie wafted through the air, a comforting reminder that life, despite everything, could be simple. Dottie was already inside, of course, sitting in their usual corner booth with a slice of pie in front of her. Her eyes lit up when Marjorie walked in, the unspoken bond between them solid and sure. "To the woman who got out of the car and never looked back," Dottie said, her voice thick with affection and pride. Her hands rested on the table, her smile warm but knowing. Marjorie laughed, the sound rich with a freedom that felt new. "Correction, I drove forward," she said, sliding into the booth opposite Dottie. The two women sat there in companionable silence for a moment, the world outside carrying on, indifferent to the quiet victory they both knew had been won. Marjorie took a bite of her pie, the sweetness of it settling in her chest, the warmth of the moment enveloping her. She hadn't known how to move forward at first. She hadn't known how to let go of the past. But now, she had built something solid, something unbreakable. The past no longer defined her. Her future, her own voice, her own choices, was what would shape the rest of her life. Her phone buzzed once more, a text from Blake. She glanced at it but didn't pick it up immediately. She already knew what it would say. "You really think you've won?" The question was tired now, its sting long faded. Instead of reading it, Marjorie set the phone down on the table beside her, her fingers resting on the smooth surface. She didn't need to answer. She didn't need to justify herself. The truth was, Blake had kicked her out of the car. He had told her to walk home. But she had picked up the keys he dropped, climbed into the driver's seat of her own life, and never looked back. And now, she was home. The final line was simple, but it carried everything she had learned. My son kicked me out of the car and said, "Walk home." The keys he dropped were mine. Marjorie took a deep breath, savoring the sweet taste of freedom. The road ahead was hers, and this time, she would never let anyone take the wheel from her again.